Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 28 of our reading of Twilight Zone. 26 Unforgettable Explorations into the Realm of the Supernatural. So yeah, we are going to continue where we left off. Let me see, write something here. Okay, now then, so, now we are going to, okay, first of all, we need to go over the copyright information. It should be on the screen right now. It says right here, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone is copyright 1963 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited is copyright 1964 by Cayuga Productions Incorporated. All rights reserved. This 1983 edition is published by Bonanza Books, distributed by Outlet Book Company Incorporated, a Random House company, and the address is there. This book was previously published as two separate works entitled Rod Serling's Twilight Zone and Rod Serling's Twilight Zone Revisited, printed and bound in the United States of America and the Library of Congress. Information is there if you're interested in that. Anyways, let's go. We've been reading Dead Man's Chest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Dead Man's Chest. And there was, okay. They have found the ghost of Jed Brock. And then they returned the skull. That's basically, they found the place. After really searching, and we're going to see what happens. We're probably going to finish this story in this episode. So anyways. Then let him have it. Frantically, Lou was tugging at the box clamps. The lid came open and Lou gave the box a tilt. Here it is. Craig caught the skull as it rolled out, held it poised for a breathless moment as the thunder flashed, a tremendous roll, and the lightning flared, again showing the headless horror ready for its final lunge. Then Craig flung the skull with all his might straight at the weird shape that had now materialized to completely solid form. What happened then was strangest of all. The skull stopped in midair as it hit the grotesque figure, then dropped straight down. At the same instant, the materialized form vanished. The effect was elusive, for the lightning flickered at that moment, but when it flared again, there was no sign of the ghost or the skull. Both were gone, like the sudden ear-splitting thunderclap that came like a monstrous note of their departure. Lou and Craig stayed huddled while the lightning lessened and the thunder rolled to dwindling fashion down the Hudson. The rain reduced to a drizzle and the entire storm abated, as though the work was done. In the light of the distant flares, they saw no further sign of the vanished ghost. Then dawn was streaking the sky, and daylight brought the surety that the two treasure seekers had felt the night before. Ghost or no ghost, the skull that Craig had flung in sheer, stark desperation could not have gone far. The slope below the hump was studded with too many bushes, roots, and rocks for a thing to roll on down the path that followed the course of White Brook. Yet when Lou and Craig reached the exact spot where the skull had fallen, as though striking something solid, there was no sign at all of the grisly object. Could Jed's ghost have grabbed it and fled with it? If so, there was no reason why it should have gone far. Thinking in such terms, Lou looked toward the beginning of the slope. Suddenly he pointed and exclaimed, "Look!" Little rivulets still were trickling from heavy rain. Some were joining others. Others were forming pools, but one tiny stream was pouring down beneath a low rock into a hole from which it did not emerge. "The skull!" exclaimed Craig. "It rolled down in there." Together, Lou and Craig shoved away the rock and found a larger cavity. With a pickaxe and spade that they brought, they worked frantically, digging through loose earth, prying out embedded stones. Finally, the pickaxe struck metal, and metal the rusted lid of an iron chest. As they dug around the coffer to release it from the roots that had gripped it over many years, they came across the bones of a human skeleton, all except the skull. But when they finished managing to haul the heavy chest up from the hole, a loose object dislodged itself from between two stones that trapped it, and tumbled down into the pit to join the skeleton remains. The rolling object, which for the moment was very like a living thing, was the missing skull of Jed Brock, reunited at last with the body to which it belonged. For the coffer, when Lou and Craig opened it, proved definitely to be the dead man's chest. The name of Jed Brock, boatswain's wife of the Quedagh merchant, was inscribed within the lid. Captain Kidd penuriously, to the last degree, had used his victim's own chest as a treasure coffer, possibly believing that it would further encourage Jed's headless ghost to haunt the spot. In the chest, Lou and Craig found Spanish doubloons, British sovereigns, French Louis D, or other currency, which, at its present value of gold, were worth thousands of dollars, with added value as rare coins. There were jewels, too, that Kidd had looted from ships in the Indian Ocean. In all, a haul sufficient to guarantee each treasure finder a few new cabin cruisers and perhaps even a castle on the Hudson. But it was after they had dragged their find down from the mountain and stowed the chest, treasure and all, aboard the Willy-Nilly that Lou and Craig began to realize just how lucky they had been. As Craig headed the cruiser out into the river and swung slightly upstream to clear the cove, he gestured towards the towering edge of Round Hill and asserted, I sure called the turn. Kidd saw the mountain that looked like a skull, so he buried his treasure, on top after making Jed help him lug it up there. If Kidd figured it looked like a skull, retorted Lou, who was studying the mountain, he really had a wild, fantastic imagination. No wilder than yours. You saw the grinning mouth, the nose and eyes, even the flattened top of the head. You pointed them out to me. Yes, but they weren't here when Kidd came up the river. Look. As Craig looked, Luke continued, I know now what I couldn't see. I know now why I couldn't see the skull except in just the right light and the proper distance. As it gets closer, it loses its effect. There's the mouth. See what it is? Why? Craig was stammering in amazement. It's the posts of the old pier from riverboat days, and the windows of the tavern and the old buildings spread out from it. They hadn't been here more than 150 years, and that was long after Kidd's time. Right, and the nose above came later than that, chuckled Lou. It's formed by the twin tunnels where the railroad tracks go through the hill. Utterly confounded, Craig looked higher and exclaimed, and those eyes! Why, they are part of the highway that curves around the mountain. They are the parking spaces that were built as overlooks so tourists can stop and see the river view. And away up above, added Lou, is that flat place we mistook for a natural ledge. It is ground they leveled off and put in a concrete foundation for a new airplane beacon. That was several years ago, and here is a new map that has it marked as Signal Tower B, but it hasn't been built yet. Steamboats, railroads, automobiles, airplanes, Craig listed them in order. None of them were ever dreamed of when Captain Kidd sailed up here with his treasure. What an imagination he had. Maybe he just dreamed of the future, speculated Lou, as we dreamed of the past. Anyways, Kidd's treasure is our treasure now. Thanks to Jed Brock, reminded Craig gently. Oh, Craig Gentry. We started on this hunt with a dead man's skull, remember? Yes, agreed Lou Barton. And we're coming back with the dead man's chest. Okay, and that is going to do it for that story. Oh, this is kind of cool. 13th. Okay, now we are going to read the 13th story. Dobin and Chadley, importers, were located in the Longview building, one of those quickie skyscrapers that sprouted up during the roaring 20s and managed to survive even after modern glass, chrome, and plastic construction began to dominate the Manhattan skyline. 20 odd stories high. The Longview building stood on a plot of ground the size of a postage stamp in comparison. It was tall, but so thin that each story had only space enough for an office in the front, a display room in the middle, and a storage room in back, plus the single shaft of an elevator, which, after many years, was converted to the automatic type. The building was particularly suited to firms like Dobin and Chadley because it gave them a whole story to themselves without too high a rental. Homer Dobin, the senior partner, was a little wizened old man who never smiled nor said much. Luke Chadley, the junior partner, was much younger and not only a glib, forceful talker, but a human dynamo like almost everybody else in the Longview building. They seemed to know their business. The only problem that Howard Crail, the owner of the building, ever had with Dobin and Chadley was when they signed their lease. Dobin looked over the fine print and was willing to accept it, but Chadley, in booming, loud voiced style, took exception to the very first clause as he exclaimed, "You've given us the 14th story. What about the numbering in the building?" he demanded sharply. "Doesn't it have a 13th story?" "Why, no," admitted Crail. It has been a regular custom to leave out 13 when numbering the stories in a building. "I'm not talking about custom," stormed Chadley. "I'm talking as a customer. This building is 20 stories high, so it must have a 13th story." "Well," conceded Crail, "technically it does have, but—" "That's all I want to know," snapped Chadley. "Then this 13th story that you are forcing on us is actually... Oh, the 14th story that you're forcing on us is actually the 13th story." No, it is really the 14th. "Don't tell me. I can count. I don't like the number 13. Whether it is real or disguised." Chadley turned to Dobin. "We won't sign, will we?" The senior partner agreed they shouldn't. Oh, wow, this is a super short one. "The only other vacant story is the 12th, declared the building's owner. "But you may not want that either because, you see—" "We'll see if we like it," put in Chadley, "and if we don't, we'll take it. But, if we do, we'll take it. Don't try to tell us that 13th isn't an unlucky number. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be so many buildings without a 13th story. But one from 14 still leaves 13. That's why we won't take the 14th story." That settled it. Dobin and Chadley took the 12th story, found it the same as the rest, and took it. But Howard Crail couldn't help wondering why a man as keen-mannered as Luke Chadley should be so superstitious. Then, there was a very deep and total unsuspecting reason behind it. Secretly, Chadley was plotting a very dastardly but very clever long-range crime. He intended to do away with his aged partner when the right time came, and Chadley didn't want to worry about any silly jinx that might cause him to make a slip at a critical moment. Having gotten the notion of the 13th story out of his system, he promptly dismissed it from his mind and concentrated on the project that lay ahead of him: murder. The way Dobin and Chadley operated was this. Homer Dobin, through long years as an importer, had connections all over the world and made excellent deals. One month the storeroom would be stocked with Swiss watches, the next month with Australian kangaroo leather, and so on. Chadley, making the rounds of the wholesalers, would often have the goods sold at a fancy profit as soon as the shipments arrived, for Dobin had an uncanny way of importing only the type of merchandise that was both needed and wanted by the trade. With their profits, Dobin and Chadley bought other merchandise and finally accumulated $1 million worth of one very special item: diamonds. Old Dobin kept them in a wall safe in the office, and now, with the lease running out after a few years, he decided that this was the time to sell them and turn the profit into a whole lot more. Dobin preferred to go to California and make sales to jewelers there, while Chadley favored Europe. However, in this case, Dobin, as senior partner, had the entire say. Not only that, their private agreement stipulated that only 25% of the total proceeds were to go to Chadley as junior partner. So Dobin, who alone knew the combination of the wall safe, decided to stay until about 9 o'clock and then leave the office in time to catch his 10 o'clock plane for Los Angeles. Chadley, without breathing a word of this to his partner, booked passage on a 9 o'clock airliner to Europe for the same evening and reserved vacation accommodations at a resort hotel in the Swiss Alps. Never had Chadley shown any dissatisfaction regarding his arrangement with Dobin. He had let Pop, as he called his partner, have full control, but they had kept their business so closely to themselves that it seemed that if something happened to one, the other could walk out with all the assets and nobody would be wiser. Something was to happen to Dobin tonight. To make sure it did, Chadley went up to the office with Pop after they finished a pleasant dinner together at a neighborhood restaurant. They entered the Longview building and pressed the button for the elevator. It came down dark, as Lubin, the janitor, usually turned off its lights at night, and Chadley often did the same. Dobin entered, turned on the light switch, and pressed the button number 12. When they reached their floor, Dobin stepped out first. Chadley followed, did two things. He pressed the top button to send the car up above the 12th floor. Then he planted a gummed block of hard rubber against the end of the heavy door of the elevator shaft. When it closed, it did not go quite all the way shut. After they chatted a while in the office, Chadley said to Dobin, "Look, Pop, I want to see some friends on Long Island, so why don't I take you in a cab to the airport right now? We can talk out there until your plane time." Dobin agreed. He opened the safe, took out the diamonds, and put them in a very special briefcase. He went out to the elevator carrying the briefcase. Chadley followed. "Are you pressing the button for the car?" he asked. "Your ticket, Pops. Are you sure you have it?" Dobin set the briefcase against the wall, found his ticket in his pocket, and nodded. He wasn't watching Chadley, who now pressed the door edge with his fingers, drew the door to the elevator shaft open, and at the same time reclaimed the hard rubber block. He picked up the briefcase with his other hand and said, "Here is the elevator, Pop, and here is your briefcase. Somebody might have turned off the light, so step right in and turn it on again." Dobin reached for the briefcase and stepped squarely into the yawning blackness of the shaft. As he suddenly realized that the car wasn't there, the old man wheeled about and grabbed for Chadley, who expected it and knew that if Dobin's fingers gained a grip, it would be a death clutch. But Chadley was prepared for that. He swung the briefcase hard against Dobin's face, literally sweeping him back into the shaft like a figure of straw. That brutal blow was calculated to break any death grip, and with it, Chadley swung full about. He was planning that too, for all in the same action. He grabbed the big door and gave it a tug that sent it clanging shut. For one grim, prolonged moment, Chadley shut his eyes to black out not only the scene, but all memory of what had happened. He was leaning against a closed door, as he had so often pictured he would be enclosing it. He had cut off any sound of Dolben's last scream, as well as any crash from below. So now, to Chadley, it was just something that hadn't happened. At least not yet. It was time for Chadley to be leaving for his plane to Europe. Not for another hour or more would Dolben have been on his way to the airport. Later, people would think that the accident happened at that time. Coolly, Chadley pressed the button and brought the elevator car down to the 12th floor. It arrived there lightly, and Chadley waved back to the office, calling, "Goodbye, Pop," as though Dolben were still alive. Then he went down in the elevator, turned off its light, and went out by the street door, as he always did. Next, he was in a cab, telling the driver to take him to Idlewild and to hurry. Only the driver didn't hurry. They moved along at a steady, constant pace, while the cabbie kept soothing Chadley in a monotone, "Listen, friend, you never get nowhere thinking ahead. Don't worry about places before you get there, or you'll be back where you started, like with me, the time I went through a dead end and plunged into the river. I was in a hurry to get back to town, and do you know what? That's where I thought I was. All that evening I was at a party, then I was home and getting up the next morning to take a shower, and splash, I was in the river, and it was the night before. That jarred me back to my senses, and I got the door open and came up. But that could have been the end of me, and I'd never have known it until the last moment." The driver went on, but so did the cab, and suddenly they were at the airport with plenty of time for Chadley to make his plane. Then he was clutching Dolben's precious briefcase, Chadley's own briefcase now, while he was letting his other luggage be weighed. From there, Chadley next found himself at the gate, waiting for it to open, when he heard two army flyers talking nearby. One was telling of a harrowing experience. "Believe me," the flyer said, "when that chute wouldn't open, there was just one moment when I wished hard that something would save me. I must have blacked out, for I thought for sure the thing did open. There I was, floating down to the ground. Then I was in the truck going back to base. Next I was getting my discharge, which isn't due for a year from now. Then I was in a bathing suit, roaring along in a speedboat, and bang, we hit a snag or something. There was a jolt, and I was looking up at that chute just as it opened like a big balloon, putting me right back where I was when all this crazy chain of thought began. If I had hit the ground instead with no chute, it would have been the same sort of shock, only it would have been the end of me." The two flyers drifted away, and now Chadley was on the airliner, dozing comfortably as they spanned the Atlantic. Next, he was going through customs in the same way, letting bowing officers see that the briefcase contained nothing but papers, because all of the diamonds were in a very cleverly double lining where Dolben had carefully placed them, while Chadley had watched him. Finally, Chadley was checking in at the Swiss resort hotel, where he was given Suite 3B, which he had reserved. Each day he went out to the veranda, lolling around, having an attendant bring him the New York newspaper as soon as it came in. Always he was looking at the distant snow-clad mountain with rocky ledges. One day 2 men paused near Chadley's deck chair. One had a limp and leaned heavily on a cane as he pointed to the distant summit. "That's where I went off," he said, "from that high ledge. We were on the way down when the rope broke. Just as I went over the brink, I seemed to catch myself, then everything was all right, and we came down the mountain, laughing at my near accident. We were here in the hotel. I was at the dance that night, and the big banquet a week later. Then all of a sudden I was overwhelmed by a huge avalanche." "That must have been when you hit the snowbank," exclaimed the other Exactly, the first man said. You can see it there, 1,000 feet below the lead. I took it I took it at a slant, and that's what saved me. But if I'd hit those rocks instead, my crazy dream would have ended as it did, but permanently. The two mountain climbers were gone, and the attendant was stopping beside Chadley, saying, "Your New York paper, sir." And Chadley glanced at the front page, as he always did. His gaze was riveted by two photos side by side, Dolben's and his own. With them was the caption, "Partners in life, partners in death." Something seemed to crash like Luke Chadley head on. His whole dream sequence ended in an utter and absolute blackout. A minute or so later, the attendant came back, found the newspaper flapping in an empty deck chair. He picked it up, carried it to the lobby, and handed it to the clerk, who read English and liked American newspapers. The clerk saw the name Luke Chadley and exclaimed, "My word, that's the name of the man who reserved Suite 3B beginning a week ago. No wonder he never came to take it. He looks a lot like that man out in the deck chair," commented the attendant, studying Chadley's photo. "What happened to this fellow?" "He fell down an elevator shaft in New York," replied the clerk, "trying to save the old man you see here. They were partners, and when the bodies were found, they were clinging tightly together. Each was holding upon a briefcase that contained their whole fortune, $1 million worth of very fine diamonds. My, how unlucky they were." Those were the very words that Howard Crail was saying in New York when he discussed the sad fate of two of his best tenants who had ever rented space in the Longview building. Crail was talking to Lubin, the janitor, as they studied the elevator and tried to figure out why it hadn't been at the 12th floor. The 12th story, when Dolben and Chadley thought they were stepping onto it. "My, how unlucky they were," Crail exclaimed, but Chadley had a hunch that something of the sort would happen. He wouldn't take the 14th floor because he thought it was the 13th. Lubin's face went puzzled. "But isn't the 14th really the 13th story?" "Not in this building." Crail pointed to the button panel in the elevator. "See the letter M? It stands for main floor, which is really the first story. So counting the rest going up, one will be 2, 2 will be 3, and so on. Stop when you get to 13. Lubin counted and stopped on the number 12 as he announced, 13 say, but that's only the 12th. And that was where Dolben and Chadley had their office." "You're right," responded Crayley. "That was really the 13th story." We're going to stop it here. We've been reading from Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. We're going to start this new story, Two Live Ghosts, when we get back. Oddly enough, the 13th story is actually the 13th story in the book, which is kind of clever. Anyways, we have been reading from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone, and specifically the 13th story, which is the 13th story in the book. So, anyways, if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe, ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, want to support me in any way, if you want to join the Discord server, all the information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.